Hi everybody, my name is Hannah, this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a tutorial to share with you today. We are going to be knitting some peg doll hats, and I have a pattern comparison to share with you. So I've got two sets of needles, and we're going to be using the size 7 needles for our worsted weight yarn. You can use smaller needles for a lighter weight yarn. And I'm going to measure out about 1.5 lengths worth of yarn, and I'm using my knitting needles as a measuring device. So now we're going to loop it and do a little slip knot, and I'll do this slowly and I'll do it twice for you. This will be a slow tutorial. I want to take you through the entire process of working through one pattern, and then on the blog post that accompanies this video, you can see all the variations. So now it's time to take our needle and slip it through our slip knot, and then we want to tighten it, but we don't want it to be too snug. You can see that's a little bit too loose here, so we want to make it a little bit more snug. And then we're going to be doing 15 stitches to cast on. Now, depending on whether you are a tight knitter or a loose knitter, you're going to end up with either a larger or a smaller hat. So we want to be somewhere in the middle. I tend to be a tighter knitter, so when I'm not paying attention, I end up knitting a little bit too tightly. So we're going to begin by casting on, and this is one method of many different methods you can use to cast on. And I'm going to be taking the yarn around my thumb and my index finger, and I'm going to use my knitting needle in order to grab it from one side to the next and loop it through. So we want to do this 15 times, and we need to count through and make sure that we do have enough stitches. It's pretty easy to take them off if you do too many or to add extra, and we just want to count by 2, and we're just going to double check that we actually indeed have our 15 stitches. This is a very forgiving pattern, so even if you don't have quite as many or you decrease incorrectly, I find that it's completely okay in the end. We're going to start by knitting 2 rows. I'm going to do this really slowly, and again, there are so many different ways and techniques to knit, and I'm showing you the way that I have become familiar with. So we're going to be taking our knitting needles. These are birch knitting needles, and they are made out of wood. They're very smooth and really nice. And I like them because they aren't too smooth, so your projects don't slip off. And yet, at the same time, they're a little bit smoother than the handmade ones that we made that can end up snagging a little bit. I'm using the unplied wool yarn. This is by Lamb's Pride. I like using the worsted weight to do the hats. If you use the bulky weight, they end up being too big and bulky, and I didn't really like the way they look so much. So the heaviest yarn I would use is the worsted weight. You can find this undyed yarn at A Child's Dream. You can find the links to all of the materials that I am using for this project on the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find that link down in the description box below. We're nearly done knitting 1 row. Now I tend to knit a little bit on the tighter side, and for the first row it's not a big deal, and I do like having the hat be a little bit more snug around the rim of the hat. However, by the time you're getting to your second row of knitting, if you tend to be a tighter knitter like I am, then I would recommend that you make a concerted effort to be a little bit more balanced or a little bit more loose with your second row, because when we get to our third row, which will be our decreasing row, the tighter you are with your stitches, the more challenging it's going to be to take 2 stitches together to knit them in order to decrease. So once we are done with that second row, it's time to start the fun, and that is to start decreasing your stitches and your rows so that you can end up with what looks like a triangle shape at the end. So I am counting my stitches to make sure that we still have what we started out with, and now we're going to take the first 2 stitches and we're going to knit them together. So you want to make sure that you are taking your needle, going through both of those stitches correctly. You don't want to end up grabbing other parts of your knitting project or your yarn. So you're going to take those 2 stitches, knit them together, then knit 1 stitch. Then we're going to do this again, taking 2 stitches, knitting them together. And that one was a little bit tight. and then we're going to continue alternating between knitting 2 stitches and 1 stitch for this entire row. Now, on occasion, I have gotten back into knitting rather than decreasing, and you can unknit and then continue and decrease, or you can just continue and decrease the following row. It will alter the size a little bit, but because these are peg doll hats and because they're quite forgiving, I usually just work with my mistakes rather than unknitting a project like this. So now we can count up our stitches, and we are going to be down to 10 stitches. Now, in between each decreasing row, I'm going to knit 1 single row just normally. And this is going to allow your project to decrease slowly, and it's going to give a nice look in the end. However, as you get towards the very end of the project, you may choose not to add those extra rows, and that will give you a more beanie-shaped hat rather than a pointy-shaped hat. And I will show you those differences at the end of this tutorial. Depending on how many stitches you have, when you are decreasing your row, you will either start by knitting 1 and then knitting 2 together, or you'll start by knitting 2 together and then knitting 1. We're nearly done with this row of decreasing, and we're going to count up those stitches. We have now 7 stitches, and we're going to give it another single row before we decrease again. Our goal is to make it down to 3 stitches before we bind off. Now you can at this point just do decreasing rows, but you want to make sure that if you're doing that, you have enough rows to begin with in order to complete the hat. Otherwise, it will be too small and it won't actually be a beanie. It will be much smaller, but it will be nice and curved and not so pointy. These hats each take about 15 minutes or less to knit them, so they are a quick project. So now we are down to 5 stitches, and at this point you can add a row or you can begin by decreasing. I'm going to go ahead and add 1 more row right here. It's going to be very quick, and this is going to both make my hat larger as well as make it a little bit more pointy. Once we're done with this row, we will begin our last decreasing row, and with 5 stitches left, we're going to knit the first 2 together. And at this point, you can see that they're fairly loose, so it's going to be really easy to take those 2 stitches together. Then we're going to knit that single stitch in the middle by itself, and then take those last 2 stitches and knit them together. And at this point, you have 3 stitches left. You can add a row here, or you can begin by binding off. If you bind off, you want to knit the first 2 stitches normally. Then you're going to slip that first stitch over your second stitch. You're going to knit that last stitch, and once again, you're going to slip that first stitch over that second stitch. Now we need to just trim our yarn, and I did trim it a little bit too short. You want to give it about 6 to 8 inches. We're going to take that tail and slip it through that loop, and then we're going to pull it gently, and then we can tug it a little bit, and that's going to give us a nice knot at the end. Next, we're going to take our sewing knitting needle, and we're going to sew up our little triangle into a hat. Now you can see that it's nice and pointy at the top, and you can leave it like that. I prefer to tuck that little point in and give it more of a beanie shape, so I'm going to do that. Both are completely fine. It's just a style preference, and I prefer them to be a little bit more tucked in because they're going to end up being pretty pointy anyway. So by tucking in that little top part, I reduce how pointy it's going to be. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew that all the way down to our original tail, and you can tie both of those tails together. Then we want to weave our tail back into our hat, and that way we're going to have a nice clean finish, and we're going to also keep it from coming undone. If you just tie it off and then trim it tightly, then you have a greater chance of it coming undone. Granted, if you're going to be putting these onto a peg doll and gluing them in place anyway, then you are not at risk of them coming undone quite as much. So we're going to take that other tail and we're just going to sew it or weave it back into our hat, and then we can pull that through and then trim it off at that point, and that just ensures a nice clean finish. So this is the smallest of the hats that I'm making with the worsted weight yarn, and you can see that it's a nice size beanie. It's not my favorite. I like them to be a little bit more loose. So you can see here that this is one that I made with more cast on stitches, and I will show you the differences between them. You can see how pointy that top part is for the hat. So I like to tuck that in and then fold it over and sew up the sides. And you can see how much larger this hat is, and I prefer that look. I prefer the look of the knitting a little bit better. So this is the fingering or sock weight yarn, and I followed a similar pattern only with 13 stitches to cast on, and you're going to see how much smaller these little hats are, and they're going to fit the female peg doll as well as the medium size peg doll. And I really like the way that these ones turned out as well. So once all of our patterns were done, which are the basic pattern with different yarns and different cast on stitches, it's time now to show you all of these and talk about them. So let me share with you the comparison between the different patterns that I use in order to do the little hats for the peg dolls and the finger puppets. The pattern that coordinates with each one, and which peg doll or finger puppet each of the patterns is going to work best with, and the types of yarns that I used. So there is a basic pattern that is going to be the foundation for all of these different hats. And I do have them all on the blog post that accompanies this video. You're going to find every pattern and a picture, and which I'll show you for each of those patterns. I do want to say one thing first off, is that the size of the needles that you're going to use, the type of yarn, and how tightly or loosely you knit is going to affect the outcome of your project. It's going to affect the overall size of your hat. And so what will be maybe a looser, larger hat for one knitter might be a tighter, smaller hat for another knitter, even if you're using the same pattern, because it depends on how you are knitting, your style, and then even the subtle variations in the type of yarn that you use. It's possible that some may feel or look fuller, even though they're the same type of yarn. I noticed that the plied yarn versus the unplied yarn in the different weights knit a little bit differently. And as a beginner knitter, I've been a novice knitter for about 15 years now. I can't tell you too much about the details in how to size up or down depending on the size needle you use and the type of yarn you use. So I just want to share with you the patterns that I have written down and made based on the original pattern in the book Making Peg Dolls by Margaret Bloom. That was the original inspiration for these hats. Now, I was in contact with the author. She did say that in the latest version, the latest new printing of her book, there is an updated version of the hat pattern that is in the book. So look out for that because they're going to be different. This is the book called Making Peg Dolls by Margaret Bloom. It is an awesome resource. There are tons of projects. The peg dolls that she makes are absolutely adorable. They are divided up throughout the seasons. They do require additional supplies, but it is well worth the investments. We've made so many of these peg dolls as well as ones that we've made on our own, and they're just adorable and charming. The hat pattern that you're going to find in the book is under the Martinmas peg dolls, and there may be others in the book as well, but this is the one that I was inspired by and I altered in order to make our own hats. So the original pattern is in the book. However, if you have the original printing, the updated version of the book is also going to include an updated pattern. I just want to put that out there for you. I have been in contact with the author. She did give me permission to share my hat patterns inspired by her book. So the first ones I want to share with you are ones using the worsted weight yarn. This is from A Child's Dream. This is by Lamb's Pride, and these are my favorite yarns to use. They're 100% wool, or almost 100% wool. I apologize. I might have incorrectly said that. They are wool yarns, and I have been using them in our homeschool for so many years. And the very first knitting projects that my children do are using the Lamb's Pride bulky weight yarn. This is the worsted weight. So for this yarn, I used these knitting needles. They're also available at A Child's Dream. These are, I believe, birch wood knitting needles. They are size 7. They are nice and smooth. We have made our own DIY knitting needles before. Totally fine, totally suitable, really well, like a good project for young children first starting out to knit. However, I do recommend that you either use the highest quality materials you can when you're making your own, or you spend a fair amount of time sanding them down and sealing them, because if they're not perfectly smooth, it will make the knitting process very difficult and you'll get a lot of snags. So if you are looking for a good quality pair of knitting needles, I do recommend these for a couple of reasons. One, I love working with wood and natural products. You can find them in other materials. However, I do prefer this material because they're not too loose, rather not too slippery, the way you'll find with metallic knitting needles, and they don't snag too much. So it's a right balance. Like, you're not going to lose your project, and at the same time, it's not going to snag. So I do really appreciate the wooden knitting needles. So these are size 7, and this is appropriate for the worsted weight yarn. However, you can size up and down depending on the kind of look you want to achieve. And also within worsted weight, there is a range of needles you can use. So you don't always have to use just one size knitting needle. You can actually use a range of sizes. And so I just want to put that out there, that you may find different resources stating different size needles depending on the weight of the yarn, but I have seen a range. So I just want to say that if you just have the one knitting needle or a set of knitting needles and it doesn't match, look for the range. So we used our size 7 for the worsted weight, and let me share with you the different patterns and how they look, because each one is going to look a little different depending on how many cast on stitches you begin with. So let me start with this one. This one looks a little bit more like a beanie. We did 15 cast on stitches, then we knit 2 rows, and then we began decreasing. Now, depending on whether you do extra rows of knitting between your decreasing rows will result in either a flatter beanie or a more pointed beanie. So you can see here you have slightly more pointed beanie. Also, this is a different type of yarn, but you're going to end up with a flatter beanie or hat if you're doing less rows between, or no rows between your decreasing rows when you get to about 10 stitches or less. And you'll get a more pointy hat if you're adding a single knitting row between your decreasing knitting rows, starting at about when you have about 10 stitches or less left. Now, if this sounds confusing to you, don't worry. As a new knitter, you absolutely can achieve success with this project. Check out the blog post that accompanies this video, because it is laid out very simply so that you can see the pattern, see the result, and see the alterations on it if you want a more pointed hat. If you end up with a pointy finished project before you sew it together, you can also tuck in the very tip into your triangle as you sew it closed and kind of tuck in that pointy top. So even if you end up with kind of like a pointy top, like in this case, you can still tuck it in and sew it down so that it's more rounded. One other option is that when you are gluing it in place, you can add some glue right up at the tip, and when you glue it down, you can also have it a little bit flatter. You'll still have a bit of a point, but it won't be quite so pointy like this. You can actually glue it down so that it's a little bit flatter. Okay, so this is 15 stitches. By casting on 15 stitches, you're going to get a hat that looks like this. This works well for the peg doll. This is the large or male size peg dolls. The finger puppet head is almost the same size. The shape is slightly different because there's more of a neck here, or this is a thicker neck. So this one will also work for the finger puppet size as well. I do recommend gluing these down. They do pop off really easily. Once they're glued down, I use a hot glue gun. They stay in place really well, and I do prefer that. So the finger puppet mold, as well as the male or large peg doll, the 15 cast on stitches works really well for a small beanie. It will stretch out. This is yarn that will stretch. Also, if you are a looser knitter, it will be slightly larger. I do like to make my cast on a little bit tighter than the rest of my knitting so that once it's on the peg doll, it kind of fits a little bit more snugly. That's just a personal choice. This next one is casting on with 17 stitches and following the same pattern. Again, if you want a less pointy top, then you can omit the extra rows after decreasing less than about 9 stitches, and that version is also on the blog post. This one is casting on 19 stitches, and you can see that it is quite a bit more pointy, and that's because there is one row between each decreasing row, and that's going to give you a taller hat because you're beginning with more stitches. I like the look of a looser hat. I like the way that it comes a little bit lower down on the neck, but I don't like the pointy quite as much. So you can omit the pointiness by omitting those extra rows, or you can tuck in your point when you're sewing it closed. And the last one for this particular pattern is 21 stitches for casting on. You can see that it is quite a large hat. It's easy to slip on and off. This one would also work really well for your finger puppet. And also, if you have some of the larger peg dolls that have a space to put arms in it, then you'll notice that this one also works really well. So that would be 21 stitches to cast on, would work well for these larger peg dolls. I really like these peg dolls that come with the arms. You can use the pipe cleaners for the arms. So if you were looking for a hat pattern that would work for these larger ones as well, then 21 stitches to cast on will work. And then the pattern is basically the same. After you knit the first 2 rows for the worsted weight, because for the sport weight and the sock weight, we can also start with 4 rows, but I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But once you do your 2 rows, after that, you're going to be decreasing, adding a row, decreasing, adding a row until you're down to 3 stitches, at which point you can bind it off and sew it up. So it's the same basic concept, but you're just starting with more stitches to begin with, which means you're going to end up knitting more rows before you get to the point where you can cast off or bind off. Okay, so that would be that set with the worsted weight, and it works really well for the peg dolls as well as the finger puppets. So let's move on to the sports weight. This is a plied yarn, and it is a finer weight or lighter weight than the worsted weight. For this yarn, I used the knitting needles size 5. These are also available at A Child's Dream. For the sports weight, I altered the pattern a little bit. So I've got 2 hats here. The first one, actually, let me see if I've got, there we go. Okay. So let me just compare these for you so that you can see the difference between the hat sizes depending on how much you're casting on and how much you're knitting before you start decreasing. So both of these hats are going to fit the small peg doll as well as the female peg doll, the female shape peg doll. I don't prefer using these. I prefer using the generic or unisex shape for both the male and female peg dolls. I prefer this shape, but there also is the female shape. So for both of these, 13 stitches to cast on in the sport weight is going to fit both the female shape as well as the small shape. The difference between the two is how many rows you knit before you begin decreasing. So let me put these back here so that you can see the difference between them. They're both going to be on the pointier side. So if you don't want them pointy, then check the blog post for which rows to omit so that you have more of a beanie shape. For this first one here, we did 13 stitches to cast on, then we knit 2 rows, then we began decreasing our stitches. For this one, we cast on 13 stitches, we knit 4 rows, then we began decreasing our stitches. So you can see that it is quite a bit taller. Those extra 2 rows make it quite a bit taller, which means that for this one, even when you push it all the way down, there's still a little bit of a face exposed. For this one, if you push it all the way down, the face is completely covered. So for this one, I would probably position it like this before I glued it, and then you can see that it is quite pointy and large. You can always glue it down a little bit like this, but you can see that it makes a larger hat overall. I like this pattern for the female shaped peg dolls. I think it fits really well. And you can also see that the smaller hat, again, still fits well for the female peg doll, but I personal preference, I do prefer the one that's a little bit larger. For these little ones, I actually think that the little pointy parts of the hat are super cute, although I tend to like the ones that are shaped more like beanies versus the pointy tips. But because these seem more childlike versus these size dolls, I think that the pointy tip just kind of looks cute and childish and charming. Okay, so that would be for this plied yarn that's sports weight. I also have this yarn here that's it's lighter than sports weight, but it might be a little bit thicker than sock weight. But I'm gonna call it sock weight, even though it feels like it's a little bit in between. For this yarn, I also used my size 5 knitting needles, and I did the same 2 patterns. So let me take these off for a moment so I can show you how these ones compare. And then you can see that if you want them a slight bit smaller, sock weight is a little bit finer. So if you need smaller hats, you can follow the same pattern of doing 13 cast on stitches, knitting 2 rows and then begin decreasing. If you do that with a finer yarn, you're going to produce a smaller hat. Again, it varies depending on how tightly or loosely you knit. So you can see that this one makes an adorable little hat. It is slightly smaller, just a little bit, because it seems a little bit tighter. It's maybe not quite as stretchy as the plied yarn, which is slightly heavier, but you can see that it's just a little bit smaller in the size of this. I think you can tell better here versus the overall size of the hat. You can tell better here how the sock yarn produces a smaller hat versus the sports weight yarn. They are quite similar, so I apologize if this doesn't give you quite or rather doesn't produce a much smaller hat if you were looking for a much smaller hat with the 2 yarns. If you want something even smaller than this, you can cast on 11 stitches and make a smaller hat, but it might be just slightly too tight for this size peg doll, but it might be just right for the little tiny baby peg dolls because those heads are quite a bit smaller. So if you wanted something that was a little bit smaller, you could cast on 11 stitches, knit 2 rows, and then begin decreasing, and then it would fit just right on your little baby peg doll. You could also continue with this pattern and still use it for your tiny little baby peg dolls. Okay, and then you can see here that the point is quite a bit more pronounced with the sock weight yarn versus the sports weight. And then if you look this way, you can see that these two look a lot more similar in size versus these two. Same pattern. This one's much smaller. So this also has to do with how tightly you cast on, how tightly you knit, and you can see that with the 2 patterns, you can knit looser, or rather with the same pattern but with different weights of yarn, you can knit looser and produce a larger hat. So these 2 yarns are really, really close in weight simply because of the different brands that I'm using and the handmade quality nature of this one. And this one might be larger than a typical sock yarn, plus it's not plied. The point of sharing these different patterns and different yarns is to share with you that there is a lot of variety in making these little hats, and that with one basic pattern, you can produce many different sizes and even different shapes depending on the yarn that you use, how tightly you knit, how loosely you knit, and how many stitches you cast on. So I hope this was helpful. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video. You're going to find pictures of all of these patterns as well as the materials that I used. If you'd like to see some of our other peg doll tutorials and finger puppet tutorials, you can tap on the screen right now. That link is also in the description box below. And if you'd like to see what kind of projects we're doing on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.